So Mary, she's a very fascinating religious figure, at least for me. I've always been fascinated by her. Part of it is that she's the only female figure, certainly in all of Christianity, but probably the most famous among the world religions in the Western world. She's the only female, right? There's certainly in Hinduism, there's some female figures. There's Kuan Yin in Buddhism, but within our Western world, she's one of the few female figures that are out there. And since here in the United States, 25% of everyone here is Catholic, you get to see Mary quite a lot. She's around. But really what's fascinating to me about Mary is her role within Catholicism. In fact, there's an entire field of study around Mary. It's called Mariology. Not that original. So this very special role that she plays in Catholicism is rather unique. It's that of a mediator, right? In Catholicism, you often pray to Mary, because particularly if you're looking for intervention, something's bad happened to you, or you're looking for mercy for something you or someone else has done, you're asking for intervention to God. Could you please tell Jesus not to condemn me? And it's even in, the Hail Mary that most Catholics say. There's also a prayer to Jesus and to God. But in the Hail Mary it says, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed are thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen." We don't say, "Hey God, would you pray for me?" We ask Mary to pray for us. And I find it fascinating that religion has developed something that it doesn't exactly require that you pray to Mary or ask for her intervention, but that there's this expectation, there's this mediator to pray to God. And in fact, she's called the Mother of Mercy. And Jesus being the one who does or does not give mercy out or punishment. And I think that there's a reason for this. In the Catholic theology, really, you've got basically Jesus. So here's Jesus here. This is one of the most famous paintings, right, from Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel, painting the Last Judgment. The Last Judgment shows what happens to the saints and the sinners, who gets to go to heaven, who's cast down into hell. And I think it's actually a very, given that it's in the Vatican, it very much, it gives us a visual as much of the Catholic theology, particularly at least that at the time of the Renaissance. It's designed really to put the fear of God into you, and it's really pretty overwhelming because you see friends and family down there in the sort of lower part of this. They're being torn apart. People are begging to be, "Please don't make me go down to hell." And some are friends and family that are there, and there's those that are suffering down there in hell. Mary's sort of seen at his side up there, looking away. She's the paragon of virtue, compassionate, kind, and loving toward everyone. I think just as a little bit of a side here, if you didn't know this about this particular painting, Michelangelo finished the Sistine Chapel when he was about in his mid-60s, and he was kind of a grumpy old man at that point. And a critic, one of the cardinals, was really appalled at all the nudity, and so did this whole diatribe about how we need to go in and paint over all of this nudity. And so Michelangelo put his face on one of the characters that's down in the very, very corner there on the left-hand side. So I just think it's pretty funny. This poor guy, I don't know if that's a lesson of don't piss off God or just don't piss off Michelangelo. But why, I will leave you with that picture. There's Mary and Jesus as a close-up of them. And it's sort of this look of Jesus like, "I cast you down," and you have Mary looking aside. She can't stand to see the suffering that's there. But why do we need this intermediary? I think to understand why Mary grew up as this kind of intermediary between us and God, that we need to understand this concept of mercy. And it's a word, mercy is not a word that we use much in modern times. It's found really in our courts, right? The mercy of the courts, or we find it in religion, the mercy of God. It's connected with God's grace quite a lot. But if you look up in the dictionary, mercy actually has a very specific definition. Mercy is the compassionate or kindly forbearance shown toward an offender, an enemy, or other person in one's power. Notice that it's about power. Mercy is about power. It's about having power over someone else. It has kind of a lot of baggage that kind of comes with it. It's an uncomfortable word, and I want to confess that I've never liked the word mercy. only because of that connection between power and having power over people. And so that's part of what I ended up wanting to explore here today. There's a sense that your human agency is taken away when there's mercy, right? You don't get a say, someone else does. You have no control. So I was looking at, where does this word mercy come from? Mercy itself, as a specific word, comes from the Latin merces, which means wages or payment. It's not a word, however, that Jesus or Mary would have used to describe the people's relationship to God or to one another. The word that Jesus or Mary would have grown up with obviously would have been Hebrew. It would have been from the Hebrew scriptures, and that's the word chesed. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it entirely correctly, but it's got a sound to it, chesed. And this is the idea, this is God's unearned but steadfast love. It's always done in the context of a covenant, that God's love will always be there with you. And it's often translated in Hebrew scriptures as mercy for some reason. This is one of the things why I kind of find it really annoying sometimes to read translations, because they don't give you the sense really of what the word means. So when Jesus' words were transcribed into Greek, the Koine Greek that spread around the world, they're trying to translate this word hesed. And if you look at the Greek specifically, and I'm so glad I took 2 years of college Greek, you can see that they use actually 3 different words are used to describe mercy, or chesed. One of which is elios, which is probably the closest to chesed. It's sort of a kindness that's undeserved, but it's given nonetheless. It's often in connection to almsgiving or charity. There's this sense of responsibility to those that you have a relationship with in particular. The second one is called oiktimos, and this really should be translated as compassion. It really is straightforward compassion. The third one, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it. If anybody else would like to, go right ahead. This one actually means really sympathy for, but it has a very physical meaning to it. So we would say it actually has something to do with your bowels, believe it or not. Because this idea of the bowels, this is where the Greeks thought emotion came from, was from your bowels. So, there you go, in a sense. So what we would say something like, our heart was touched, right? Or I was moved by. That's what this word really means. But it's often described as mercy. And so here's some examples of where these words, mercy, gets changed. So in Luke 150, in our opening words today, when Mary is talking about how God has his mercy, goes on wave upon wave, she's actually talking about generations upon generations. You know, his mercy flows in wave after wave. What if it actually said his steadfast love flows in wave after wave? Doesn't it have a different meaning to it, a completely different meaning? In our reading today, we had Luke, as Jesus is telling us to love our neighbors or love our enemies. He says, be merciful as your Father is merciful. But really, he's saying, be compassionate as your Father is compassionate. Which has kind of a nicer ring to it, I think. The third word comes up in a lot of the parables, particularly in Luke, and it has to do with when you encounter someone that you are moved by. And so, for example, in the Samaritan who was on a journey, he saw him, he had mercy or pity upon him. That's often how it's transcribed, but it's actually, his heart was touched, he was moved. It also is with the prodigal son, when the father sees the son coming back. He said, I was moved, my heart was touched. So all of this to say that mercy, that sense of judgment and power, really are not found in the Christian scriptures. They're not really found actually even a lot of the Hebrew scriptures. It's much more of a modern word. So now, I'm not one who normally comes up here and does what we call an exegesis, right? You look at the script, the translations, and pick apart words. What does this have to do with Mary, and why, quite frankly, should we even care? Well, first, because I think that the veneration of Mary is telling us something about our society. And also because I think that there's some wisdom in these ancient sources that we've lost. and in particular, the meaning behind what Jesus was trying to tell us about mercy. The sense of power over comes from that word mercy. That's what we have in our modern time. But it really isn't part of the early church, and it comes much later as fear and damnation and judgment dominate the religious vocabulary. That's when it comes into play and starts to become translated into English that way. And I think it's no coincidence that Mary became such a big deal during the early church and remains so in the Catholic Church. To quote a politician, though, I don't think it's because she's playing the woman card. In other words, I don't think she became big because of her gender, although I'm sure that there's you can talk about the divine feminine and everything. But I think it has to do with this role of being a mediator and the need one. Because imagine that this is the world that you live in, right? Your image of God is one full of fear and awe. It's a power that is far beyond anything you could possibly conceive of. There's a very human need to want to have help if you are overwhelmed. Imagine having this vision of hell. And Mary's rise to prominence in the church as the mediatrix, which is actually one of her titles, it rose during the Dark Ages in particular, from about 600 to about 1500. The worship and veneration, not worship, Catholics will tell you they don't worship Mary, they venerate her, and there is an important distinction. But it starts growing more and more, and everybody is very involved with Mary and asking her to be their intermediary. But something happens during the Renaissance, actually. Her position in the church sort of dips. She's not as popular for a while. Think about what's going on in the Renaissance at this time. So it's like, well, why is that? Why would it dip? Why would it not be quite as popular? If you remember what's going on in the Renaissance at this time, right, there's all this incredible science that's going on everywhere, right? We're realizing that we're not the center of the universe, that we revolve around the sun rather than the sun revolving around us. People are starting to realize that they have their own agency. It's the rise of humanism. It's the beginning of humanism, not as we think of as a modern sense today, but that sense that we humans have agency, that we can affect our future, that maybe we don't need an intermediary. We have a greater sense of control of our own destiny. So I see Mary as kind of this touchstone in history. That's at the Dark Ages when life was bleak and child mortality was incredibly high. People died. Remember, there was all these plagues all the time. There was no health care. There was ignorance and illiteracy. And the power of the church was unbelievably skewed. I mean, we think about the 1% now. Unbelievably skewed at that time. And mostly in the hands of white, wealthy males. Is it any wonder that people needed an intermediary like Mary? Someone who understood their plight, someone who wasn't like Jesus, so far above them to be feared or in awe, who was going to come and judge them on that last day, but someone who was compassionate and kind. What's interesting is that there's been a resurgence of Mary veneration starting in the 19th and into the 20th century. In fact, this is the time when the church created two major dogmas. Two of three times only that the church said this comes directly from God. And one had to do in the 19th century with the Immaculate Conception. Now, most people think that that's about Jesus being immaculately conceived. It's actually not. It's about Mary being immaculately conceived. In order to be a vessel of God, she had to be without sin herself. So actually, that's the only, Jesus being born immaculate is not church dogma, interesting enough. The second one is her assumption. That is that when she was on her deathbed, she was taken bodily up to heaven. Those two things happened in the last 2 centuries. So people now are calling upon Mary, Mother of Mercy, in the 19th and 20th. And remember what's happening in these times. Now we've got world wars. We don't have plagues. We have wars that are abounding throughout the entire world. Rise of industrialization, people being disconnected from one another. You could see why maybe you would want somebody to intervene on your behalf. And in modern times, mercy, and to some extent Mary, has been lost that sense of commitment and responsibility that Hesed once had. That sense of steadfast love and compassion Instead of it's more of a sense of pleading, please have mercy upon me, with a person of power. And Hesed doesn't mean that, neither does Elios. We've lost the meaning of what these scriptures were trying to tell us about how to be with one another. I think we've built a world around the concept of mercy, where we've created a world where many people have lost their agency, their sense of control over their lives. And in a mercy world, which is one where mediators are needed because there are those who are voiceless that have no power to affect change. A mercy world is one where privilege, that horrible word, whether it's race privilege or class privilege, education privilege, gender privilege, all of those types of privileges, they abound. And privilege is about unearned power. It's about being the ones who get to give mercy, not the ones who receive it. I think that's one of the reasons why most of us shudder at that word privilege, at least as much as I do at the word mercy. Because to me, the two are intertwined in very uncomfortable ways. And it was very apparent to me last Tuesday when the Hispanic community, they were young and old, the undocumented, the citizens, they went before the Santa Ana City Council. And they told these heartbreaking stories of their families being torn apart like that hell. Being torn apart by ICE, right? The Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And they did this in order to get try to get ICE out of Santa Ana. There were a lot of people, they allowed 32 people to speak that night. And at the end, the council, they mentioned 4 people to say, thank you, we really like your ideas, and all 4 of them were white. We like what you have to say. And it really struck me at that point that we who have the privilege due to our education, our race, our wealth, our gender, whatever it is, we are the ones who have to stand as the intermediary to the powers that be, for those who have no voice, for those who aren't listened to. In a sense, we are Mary. And we're desperately needed in this age of no mercy. We're needed to give voice to those who either have no voice or who just aren't even listened to. And instead of mercy, we need steadfast love. We need Hesed back. We need compassion. We need to be moved in our hearts and our hands and our bodies. We need, really, to stand on the side of love. I think this is why we have been so touched by this campaign. It was started by Unitarian Universalists, but embraces people of all faith. We don't want a world where that's mercy, we're about power over people. We want to stand with people. We want to build a world that is full of compassion, because standing on the side of love conveys all that sense of responsibility, of compassion, of steadfastness that Hesed once did. I hope that you all will join me in standing on the side of love, as I know most of you have. Blessed be, may it be so, and amen.